and thanks for coming. Um, my name is Guy Lehman. First of all, welcome to Compass Financial. My name is Guy Lehman. I'm an owner and advisor here at Compass, and I am in charge of the educational events. Okay, this is an educational event that's near and dear to my heart. We'll talk about it in just a minute. But I want to talk a little bit about next month's educational event to tell you what's coming. Uh, fraud, fraud prevention. There's a lot of fraud going on right now. You hear stories of it. We have heard stories of it. We have seen clients get tangled up in it. We've seen family members, all sorts of stuff. And this is not going to be a scare the wits out of you type of fraud situation. This is going to be help you prevent fraud in your life, help you to keep from falling for the fraudsters out there and their little tricks and tips. So, we're going to be helping you to protect your wealth, your identity, your peace of mind, because this wreaks havoc on people's peace of mind when they realize what's going on out there. We're going to cover the types of fraud. We're going to cover red flags to watch for and the tips to beat the scammers. We're going to use real life examples and then talk about ways that you can stay safe. And we're also going to talk a little bit about what Compass does on your behalf to keep your information safe, your finances safe, especially around the topic of money moving around, right? Because they're always trying to get you to give them information so they can move money in some sort or fashion. Okay, that's coming up next month, so be looking into that. Today, we are talking about college finances. And I will tell you, as an advisor here, many people over the years have just wrung their hands in worry and anxiety about what are we going to do? How are we going to handle college finances? It's one of those big financial hurdles that people need a lot of help preparing for and working through. So today, I have Ryan Zanting at Drake. He is the director of financial aid at Drake. A little bit about Ryan. He is originally from Pella, Iowa. He attended, and I heard he attended Trinity College along with his now wife. Trinity is a college over in Chicago, and after he graduated, he was director of financial aid there for 11 years and wanted to move a little closer to home. So that was 6 years ago, and he's been working at Drake ever since. So Ryan is going to give us a little, well, I should say, a big, broad overview of the arc of college financial aid, how it works, where it comes from, how to navigate through it, things to think about, really to share some of his professional expertise about tips, tricks, and hacks about the college financial aid process. What is the FAFSA? And do you really need to fill it out? That's one question. Need-based aid versus merit-based and how that works. Public loans versus private loans. And he's going to get into all that. And we're going to leave some good time here at the end for Q&A. So as you hear things, make a note or jot down a question that you have. And I know I will have several questions. We'll have a good Q&A session at the end. So Ryan, take it away. Thanks for coming.
All right, thank you. Hear me okay? All right, great. Thanks. Glad to be here. And I'm going to be going through a slideshow that is provided by the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. Drake's a member of that. But then at the end, there's a few slides of my own as well. And so what we're going to discuss today, just generally, what is financial aid? We'll talk about the cost of attendance, the student aid index, which is what the FAFSA calculates, how we calculate financial need. We'll talk about different types, sources of financial aid, the FAFSA, obviously, and we'll talk about special circumstances, the appeal process, and when that might come into play. So first of all, financial aid is really anything, loans, grants, work, study, it's anything. People call financial aid just like they're thinking scholarships and grants, and of course that's a type of financial aid, but financial aid includes loans as well. Things. Cost of attendance. Every student will have a cost of attendance budget. And this budget includes the costs you would think of: tuition fees, room, board, those build costs. But it also includes allowances for other costs like books, transportation, personal expenses that student might have. The student aid index, as I mentioned, is what the FAFSA outputs. So you're going to enter a bunch of information. Some of your information from the IRS will go in there, and it goes through this complex formula. And then the output is the student aid index, which is made up of a student contribution and a parent contribution. And the student aid index is used to determine eligibility for federal and state need-based programs. It calculates remaining financial need from the cost of attendance, and institutions as well will use this to award their own need-based financial aid. So financial, the cost of attendance, sorry, I think I'm going in and out. That cost of attendance budget, subtract this SAI that the FAFSA calculates, and that is the student's gross financial need. So that's the starting point for financial need. So different categories of financial aid. We have need-based aid that would include federal and state grant. Okay, yeah, no problem.
So we have financial aid that's based on that financial need calculation, and we have other non-need based aid, which is typically merit, scholarships, that sort of thing. So different types of financial aid in this category here: grants, scholarships, loans, and work study. And typically loans and work study come under the self-help category because it's earned or repaid by the student, where gift aid, scholarships, and grants are also earned, but they're free money. They don't need to be repaid. And scholarships, okay, so yeah, I'm gonna go through some of this pretty quickly. Okay, there's also different categories of financial and different sources. So the federal government is probably the largest source in terms of federal grant dollars, as well as all the federal student loan programs. But states have their own financial aid programs as well. The state of Iowa is no exception there. Each school has scholarships and grants available. There's also private sources. So a lot of companies offer private scholarships and that sort of thing for students. And sometimes employers will offer education benefits as well for either their employees or their dependents of employees. So yeah, under the federal government, as I mentioned, there's grants, there's federal student loans. The FAFSA is what is needed to be considered for any of the federal student aid programs. And all the federal student aid programs are listed here. The Pell Grant is the most common one. The SEOG grant is a grant that many schools participate in, and it's a grant that can be offered in addition to the Pell Grant to students that are eligible for the Pell Grant. The Teach Grant is available for students going into teaching, up to $4,000 a year for that. Federal Work Study is part-time on-campus employment for students that qualify, and then the federal student loan programs as well. And states, usually there's residency requirements. You have to be a resident in the state to qualify for those state aid programs. They can be based on need or merit or both. And usually states are using the FAFSA information. The FAFSA is shared with those state aid agencies, and that is what is used to determine eligibility for those grants and scholarships. And then colleges and universities use the FAFSA as well for their own need-based financial aid programs. Oftentimes, scholarship organizations will ask for a student aid index that the FAFSA calculated or that sort of thing. And so sometimes they'll ask for that, or otherwise they'll have, their own application process. And then employers obviously check with your employer about whether anything's offered and what the process would be for that financial aid. So if you have a student that's, in high school, not ready, not going into their senior year, and you want to get a sense of what your student aid index might be without having to do the whole FAFSA, there is an estimator. So if you just Googled Federal Student Aid Estimator, or there's a URL right there, you can go there and in about 5 minutes get a general estimate of what student aid index might be calculated for your student. And that can be helpful if you're talking to schools and trying to get an idea of, what you might qualify for. If you have an estimated student aid index that they can use, I mean, that if you're talking to a financial aid office, that will quickly help them give you, an idea. So the FAFSA, what does it do? Well, it's going to collect demographic and financial information. Demographic is really to identify and confirm that a student is eligible for federal student aid programs, that they're a citizen or eligible non-citizen, etc. The financial information is going to go into that formula to calculate the student aid index, which of course is used to determine eligibility for the many different financial aid programs. So the FAFSA is typically available on October 1st. There's been the last couple of years, they kind of rebuilt the FAFSA. You probably saw headlines about it. It did not go very well, but they are making progress and continuing to iron out the kinks. And it should be available for the 26-27 cycle on October 1st of 2025. I highly, highly recommend doing the FAFSA online. There is a PDF version, but if you take a look at it, it's about 22 pages long. And you want to do the online version because there's a lot of skip logic and real-time error catching. So you're going to have a much smoother process by doing the online FAFSA, and it's much faster. You'll have the ability to go on and view your submitted responses. So there's so many benefits of using the online FAFSA. There's also a lot of help text as well. So as you're going through, you click on a field, you're not sure, how to answer that. There's going to be a help box right there with links to more information. So it is just the easiest way to do it. So to get started with the FAFSA, the student will have to set up a federal student aid account as well as any contributor on the FAFSA. And so for most students, they're coming like right out of high school or something, that's going to be a parent, at least one parent that's going to have to set up a federal student aid account. And so this is just the account that you'll use to log into the FAFSA to access it. As you're creating that account, there's some database matching that goes on. So your identity will be authenticated with the Social Security Administration, and as well as a number of other federal databases just related to financial aid eligibility. So recommend getting that done ahead of time before you want to start doing the FAFSA, because it can take 2 or 3 days before that account is fully validated and there's no restrictions to it. So that's something you can be doing, right when your student begins their senior year in high school, and just get that step out of the way. So here's a screenshot of the online FAFSA, what it looks like. You'll find this at studentaid.gov to get started. And typically I recommend starting as a student. You can start as a parent, but most of the issues that it came to light in the last year started, when people started as a parent. So I would recommend starting as a student and completing that section first. Once the student's section is completed, then they'll have the opportunity to invite any of the required contributors on their FAFSA. And that just happens there's just a few fields that the student has to fill out, including the email address of the contributor. And that should be the email address that the parent used to set up their federal student aid account. Now, I mentioned the FAFSA was kind of rebuilt a couple of years ago. One of the big changes was set in motion by the Future Act. And the Future Act allowed the Department of Education to take federal tax information directly from the IRS database and import that into the student's FAFSA. And so any student that does the FAFSA has to consent to allowing that, and any contributor on the student's FAFSA has to consent to allowing that. It really is a good thing because it means that for most people, they don't have to enter any income or tax information on their FAFSA. It's going to come directly from the IRS. Schools are going to know, and the federal government's going to know that this is accurate because it's coming from directly from the source. Previously, there was always a chance of that manually entered information being incorrect or inaccurate, right? So this increases the accuracy, cuts down on the work that parents and students need to do, and it cuts down on the work of schools having to ask for copies of the 1040 to verify that information is correct. So these are just some of the fields or the categories of what like students are going to have to complete on the FAFSA. They will enter their colleges that they want to send the FAFSA to, in addition to those other things. And when they submit the FAFSA, the results of that FAFSA will be sent to all the colleges that they list on there. So dependency status, this determines whether or not a student is going to have a parent report their financial information, or really their household information, on the FAFSA. This isn't something that students can just choose, like being self-supporting is not a dependency question. So they're very straightforward yes/no questions based on age, marital status, veteran status, orphan. Any of those kinds of like situations might make a student independent. But generally speaking, there's no, agency that a student has to say, I'm an independent student versus a dependent student. So the FAFSA will guide them through those questions, and however they answer will determine whether they're dependent or independent. If they are dependent, then the parent will need to report financial information and household information on the FAFSA. So yeah, the invitation process, as I said, the FAFSA walks, the online FAFSA walks the student right through that, and they can send the invite to the parent, and then the parent will be able to log in under their own federal student aid account and complete their information as well. So again, I'm rushing through a lot of this because we just don't have enough time to go through all the details of the FAFSA, but the online FAFSA really just walks people right through this process. So student financial information is going to be, well, the tax return information is going to be directly transferred from the IRS. There is some asset information questions. Obviously, the IRS doesn't have information about assets. So students and parents are going to report the amount that they have in cash, savings, or checking accounts, any, net worth in business or investment farms, and real estate, that sort of thing. So what should not be included, and I'm talking both parent and student here, in those assets is like retirement accounts or the value of your primary residence, or those sorts of things. And so the FAFSA does give help, a help text on what should and should not be reported. So pay attention to that as you're completing those fields, because it's pretty common that we'll see people over-reporting assets that shouldn't be reported on the FAFSA.
Okay, I'm going to step in here and have a few questions for you.
Sure.
Lower this down. So one of the questions that we get about FAFSA is, number one, do I have to fill it out? And number two, there's information on here that I don't give to anybody. Those are two things that we hear about. So I am not giving the federal government information that they want. So what's my recourse? Are you just locked out? If you do not complete the FAFSA, are you just completely locked out of the federal student aid universe?
Yes. Yep. So any kind of federal student aid requires the FAFSA.
Okay.
So yeah, if you're
Fair warning.
yes. Yep.
You're going to have to do it if you want to qualify, or at least see if you qualify for federal student aid. Okay. So the kids have to do it, and then the parents have to do it, right?
If the student is a dependent student, then the parent would be required.
Okay. Yeah. And also what I'm hearing is that they've tried to streamline the process so they can pull in as much information from other agencies in the federal government that already have your information. For instance, your income, straight from your taxes last year, straight from the IRS. Now you have to consent to that, but again, and these are also federal forms, so if you're trying to be dishonest on here, I am sure there is harsh ramifications.
If it's intentional fraud, yes, you can be
Yeah.
prosecuted for that. So
Okay.
don't let that scare you. I mean, we are always making corrections to FAFSAs because somebody answered something
Sure.
inadvertently wrong, but
Now-
intentional fraud, yeah.
All the FAFSA is all the calculations and the information in the FAFSA form is getting to one number, right? The student aid index. Okay? And this, can you sum up what the student aid index is? That number.
Yes. So two functions that the student aid index has. One is qualifying for federal or state grant programs. So I'll start with the state because that's simpler. The state of Iowa, if you attend a private college in Iowa, there's something called the Iowa Tuition Grant. Students with a student aid index of 16,000 or below can qualify for that grant. On the federal side, the Pell Grant is a function of the student's student aid index minus the maximum award. So the maximum Pell Grant award is 7,395 right now. So if the student's student aid index is below that, they get the difference. So let's say the student aid index is 4,000, 7,395 is the max award. So 3,395 would be the student's Pell Grant amount.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is the simple way to define student aid index is through this whole process, what the government thinks the student and their family can afford to pay for education every year. Is that correct?
Kind of, yeah. So the student aid index used to be called the estimated family contribution or expected family contribution. They went away from that because it really was a misnomer. A student may or may not pay what that number is.
Right.
And that would depend on where they went to college and the cost and the financial aid that they got. So really a student's net cost is what they're going to pay. The student aid index helps us determine eligibility and helps us determine financial need.
So the lower the number, the lower the student aid index, essentially what ends up happening practically is that they get more help and pay less for college.
Yes, exactly.
Generally.
The lower the student aid index, the higher the financial need.
And so you would say something under $7,000 would be considered quite low.
Probably in the lower 25% of the total students. Yes.
Okay.
So.
And then if you have a student aid index of say 25,000, that student is not going to get much in the way of federal financial aid.
Right. Would not qualify for federal grant programs. They may qualify for a federal subsidized loan, which is an interest-free loan. Likely that if they're going to a private school, they're going to qualify for some need-based assistance at a private school.
I see.
Because the higher the expense, the higher the cost of the school, the more financial need-based aid is going to be available. And so even though you might not qualify for federal or state grant programs, the school very well may award need-based aid
So
for that student.
what I'm hearing is, and we're just making up examples here because I'm trying to get a range about what's low, what's high when you get your student aid index. So if you have somebody who has a $25,000 student aid index, if they're looking at a state school, they might pay full fare. But if they're looking at a private school whose tuition is 2 or 3 times the state school, they may qualify for some need-based aid because of the cost of the college they're going to.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. All right.
Mhm.
Very good. All right. Go ahead.
No problem. So yeah, as part of the FAFSA process, there will be, at the end, a chance to review all your responses and then submit and put a signature. I'm going to skip through a lot of this because the parent section largely mirrors the student section, but it's all the same thing. Consenting to that IRS information, reporting on assets, and that sort of thing, review, sign. For independent students, that's a student where the parent does not need to be a contributor. But if the student is married, then the student's spouse is a contributor, and so there's also FAFSA. I might have slides for all of these based on the spouse. No, okay. One of the questions on the FAFSA that's actually a pretty important one is the family size. There are in that FAFSA formula, there are income protection allowances and asset protection allowances because the form recognizes that college isn't the only expense that you're going to have to pay for. There's living expenses, and so a portion of that the income that is on the FAFSA is protected based on the family size as well as the state taking into account cost of living in your region. So for a dependent student, the family size is going to include the student, obviously, the parent and the parent's spouse, as well as dependent children, even if they're not living in the household at the time. So if for families that have multiple students in college at the same time, just because the student's not in the household, if they're away at college, they can still be included in that family size, as well as other people if the parent is providing more than 50% of that person's support. So that could be an elderly parent. It could be, other situation, a nephew, a niece, a friend, somebody that the family is supporting. And as I said, more than half of their support between that year, July 1 to June 30. So when you submit the FAFSA, the federal processing system is going to send a version to the college, as well as state aid agencies. And then there's a version for the student, which is called the FAFSA submission summary. And so after you submit the FAFSA, you can view this on studentaid.gov and basically just see a summary of all the responses you put on the FAFSA, the student aid index. Sometimes scholarship organizations will ask for this, and so that's how you access it, is going into studentaid.gov. And you can print it off in there or save it to PDF. And then the school side goes into the schools. Usually it's an electronic data file that gets loaded into the school's their student information system. Sometimes corrections are needed to FAFSAs, and so studentaid.gov, you can go back in there, log back into the FAFSA, and make necessary corrections. Sometimes colleges will make the corrections on your behalf as well, based on documentation that they've received. And so when you do those corrections, it's just a resubmission and new transaction of that FAFSA is generated. So special circumstances, this is probably an area where we should spend some time because the FAFSA is based on a tax year that is old. So for students starting college this fall of 25, it's based on 2023 federal tax information. And a lot can change between that time. And so One of the most common appeal reasons is for a change in family income. Right before a student is going to start college, dad loses job, and now they're really wondering how they're going to do this college thing, right? And so schools are required to have an appeal process to take these kinds of circumstances into account. And so the goal is to replace FAFSA income data with current financial circumstances. And so that's called a professional judgment, and financial aid administrators have the ability to do that, go in and make changes to the FAFSA, replace it with more pertinent financial information, and resubmit that FAFSA through professional judgment and get a new student aid index calculated based on that updated information. So students and parents cannot do this for themselves. You have to put on the FAFSA what it requests, which is 2023 tax year information. But financial aid administrators are able to do these appeals on your behalf. So each school, like I said, will have a process. And if there is a change like that going on, you should go through that appeal process and report that. And you'll need to do that for each school, because each school will have their own policies on how they handle these things. And so if you're submitting it to one school, but your student's looking at 5, make copies and submit it to all the schools, because they'll each need to handle that appeal in their own way. So change of income is one appeal, but there are a number of different categories that can be considered. If you have high out-of-pocket medical costs, that exceed what is typical, you could report those. If you're going to have, if you have students in private K through 12, or multiple people in the family that will be going to college, those are situations where you can report that. And there's not like a definitive list of like only these things. If there's anything going on that the FAFSA does not reflect, I would say report it. It can't hurt, and schools can make decisions on in accordance with their own policies on professional judgment. So,
Ryan, quick question for you. How many, you're working at Drake, how many families of students that go through are doing this whole process? 100%? 95%? 50%?
no, it's not that high. It's probably between 5 and 10%.
Oh, I'm not talking about special circumstances. I'm
Oh.
talking about FAFSA.
Oh, the FAFSA.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. 80% of our, I'm excluding our international students who are not eligible to do the FAFSA or
Right.
anything. But yeah, probably 80% of our incoming student class every year has done the FAFSA.
What situations would someone not want to do the FAFSA? Or what situations do you see people not doing the FAFSA?
Yeah, there are families that assume they will not qualify for anything, federal, state, or institutional need-based aid, and many of them are right. There are cases where it just doesn't make sense. A lot of times, I said 80% of our incoming students will do the FAFSA. About 60% of our second-year students will do the FAFSA. So they did it the first year. No harm. I mean, it didn't cost them anything other than maybe a little time.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not borrowing federal student loans. They're not receiving any need-based aid, so they just don't do it in the future years, which is fine.
Okay.
But that's my general advice: is do it for the first year, and just make sure that you're not leaving anything on the table.
Yeah.
But even alternative advice is, if you're pretty sure you won't qualify for anything, you could do the estimator.
Yep.
Get that student aid index, share that with the school, say, this is my estimated student aid index. Is it worth me doing the FAFSA? And if it's 150,000, the school will probably say, no, it's really not. If you're not planning to borrow, and that's really one of the key considerations too. Federal student loans generally offer the best terms available for borrowing. And if you're going to borrow federal student loans, you have to do the FAFSA. So, that would be a situation. If you know you're going to borrow some, then I'd recommend doing the FAFSA. If you don't plan to borrow at all and won't qualify for anything, then you could probably skip the FAFSA. Okay, yeah, so here's some of those other circumstances where an appeal might be worth looking into. Okay, so these slides are my own content, so not NASFA, even though the branding's still there. I couldn't figure out how to get it off. So, but these are my thoughts as a financial aid director. So, can I successfully negotiate my financial aid offer? I would say sometimes. And there's two things that are true at the same time. One is higher ed enrollment is very competitive, has been for over a decade. And so it's, a lot of competition between schools, especially here in the Midwest where demographics are going down. And so schools in response are making their financial aid offers as competitive as they can. At the same time, most schools definitely want the opportunity to discuss, a possible solution if their first financial aid offer um, just is not going to cut it, right? So um, it is completely possible that a school will not be able to do more than their first financial aid offer, but there's very few schools I know that don't want you to talk to them if it's not going to work. If you want to come to their school, it's the first choice of your student. Reach out to the financial aid office or whatever that looks like. Sometimes it's the admission office or there's a one-stop shop, but reach out to the school and have that conversation. The worst they can say is no, but a lot of times they do want to work with you. So tips as far as, before the negotiation, participate in the financial aid process, do the FAFSA. If there are special circumstances, go through that appeal process. Because if you haven't done either of those and you come to the financial aid office and ask for more, there's a possibility there'll be like, you haven't even engaged the process and we need you to do that first before we talk about appeal, doing anything more from institutional aid. One thing that I hear a lot when I'm meeting with people that come into my office is like, oh, my child's going to be doing this on their own. That just doesn't align with the philosophical underpinnings of the financial aid system. It is built on the presumption that parents are going to help with their child's education. And that's, because if you could just choose whether you're going to help your student or not, everyone would say they're not helping, right? And then everybody would there would be no such thing as a needy student because everybody would be needy. So that's just not a good, like if a financial aid administrator hears that, there's two things. One is they don't believe you because they see the next year that, you took out a huge loan for the student. Or the second thing is, and this is where I usually go, is, well, then I'm not sure that Drake is the place for them. They should probably be looking at a community college or something because otherwise they're going to graduate with $100,000 of debt. Because as a high school student, they haven't had a chance to save up. They haven't, and they're not going to be able to, on their own, qualify for private loans to bridge the gap that they're going to have. So anyways, I guess I recommend avoiding that, my child's on their own for this because that's just not a good negotiating tactic, put it that way. So more tips about the negotiation process. One is being realistic. I think significant cost changes are unlikely unless there's new information that's brought to light through the appeal process or something like that. Then that's a different situation where there's new information. But if there's no new information, it's unlikely that the school is going to make a significant change. If they do, without receiving any new information, you might want to ask what that tells you about the school. One is they're lowballing you, or two is they're desperate. And both of those are things that make me think twice about the school. So, and you want to keep in mind as well, like that you're getting what you pay for. That adage rings true a little bit. understand that if you're going to be comparing cost to another school, they have to be similar schools, right? With a similar product, similar student outcomes, because some schools just frankly cost more to operate than others based on the services that they provide and that sort of thing. So you just want to bring a compelling case to the school if you're asking for them to negotiate with you. And then finally, being specific is important. A lot of times I'll say, well, school A gave me more scholarships. Well, that doesn't really mean anything because school A may cost way more too. So it's really the net cost that you want to be comparing. What is their build cost less their grant and scholarship package? What's left? And then compare that. So figuring that kind of information out and sharing that is going to be more effective in that conversation. And also,
question for you.
yeah, go ahead, guys.
So earlier you showed the COA, which means the cost of attendance.
Yep.
Okay, that's in this calculation. Where do you find the cost of attendance? Is that searchable online? Is it only searchable? Do you only know how much it's going to cost of attendance is after you apply to a school, or where is that information?
Yeah, every school is required to have the cost of attendance on their website. There should be a link to their full cost of attendance on any web pages that talk about the cost of tuition,
Gotcha.
that sort of thing.
Okay.
Now, keep in mind, cost of attendance includes those build costs as well as those other costs, which are really cost estimates of what the school thinks a student might have, informed by their own philosophy on living standards for a student. So a lot of times when I'm talking to families, they're trying to compare the net build cost versus the net cost of attendance. So because they figure they're, really how much money a student is going to pay for off-campus housing, that depends on the student, right? And whether they're going to get a studio apartment on their own or they're going to cram into a 2-bedroom apartment with 3 other guys, right? So there's a lot of that cost that really is up to personal choice on the decisions that they make. But the build costs, those are determined by the school, right? So, and yeah, the other advice I'd have is be specific about what you need, because schools have a very limited budget of like what they can use in negotiations, and so usually they do, and so they want to use that to provide a solution and not as part of a drawn out open-ended negotiation process. So if a family comes and says, hey, we're almost there, we need 4,000, and we're there, that is a much easier decision to make than just to say, well, we just do whatever you can do, because that just sounds like an open-ended and drawn-out negotiation process. And schools really want to leverage the available dollars they have to provide solutions, and from the school side to secure the student, right? So those are kind of some of my tips on the conversations that I've had over the years, and how both parties really can come to agreement that works for both, if possible. I mean, sometimes it just doesn't work either. Sometimes schools just aren't able to meet the full need of a student, depending on the type of institution. So that is the end of my formal presentation. It looks like we're right on time here. So,
Yes,
yeah.
we do have time for questions. Hold on a sec. For the people online, we need to, yeah.
I am confused, or I didn't write it down. So if your income changes, is that you had special circumstances and you had something else? Which one is that?
Yeah, special circumstances is the appeal. So if income changes after the base year on which the FAFSA was, asking for, that is a special circumstance that you'll want to report via the appeal process. Mhm.
Okay, thank you.
Give us some examples of what shows up from the student contribution standpoint versus the parent contribution standpoint on the FAFSA form.
Okay. So yeah, the student aid index is made up of a student contribution and the parent contribution. The parent contribution is based on, it's a pretty complex formula, but it starts with their taxable income, or their adjusted gross income, rather. It's a starting point. And a portion of that is protected. It's called the income protection allowance, and that is based on the family size and the state that they live in and the parent's status. Are they a married parent? Are they a single parent? So there's different tables that determine how much of that adjusted gross income is protected. And then there's the parents report assets. Depending on the parent's age and how close they are to retirement, there's an asset protection allowance as well. And so a certain percentage of that reported asset is protected. But then that formula, kind of just figures out, okay, how much of this income is available, how much of this asset is available for purposes of this formula, and it calculates that parent contribution. And the same thing on the student side.
Okay, so essentially, if your student has a lot of assets in their name, the FAFSA is going to look at that and say a large percentage of that can be used for education. If parents have high incomes and large assets, they probably not as high a percentage, but certainly a percentage of those high numbers is viewed upon, hey, this could be used to educate their children.
Yep. So parent assets are considered available for FAFSA purposes towards the student aid index at 5.6%, not to exceed 5.6%. Sometimes it's lower than that. Student assets are like 30%. So yeah, having the assets in the parent's name is going to be much more beneficial than having it in the student's name.
Awesome. Next question.
Thanks for being here. This has been good information. In any of your information, you talk about parents' contribution, students' contribution. I'm a grandparent. I don't see any grandparents' contribution up there. Specifically around 529s, if I open up a 529 for I've got a 10-month-old grandson now. Would it be beneficial for me to keep myself as both the owner and the beneficiary so it doesn't play into that contribution conversation? And secondly, did I also understand that if there's money left in a 529, it can be converted to a Roth IRA now?
Great question. I'll answer that to begin with here. Just to clarify, 529 is a very specific type of savings account created specifically for educational costs. Okay. So just a little bit of background there. Each state typically has one of their own, as does Iowa. And so people that live in Iowa can put money into a 529 account. They can deduct that from their state taxes up to a certain limit and have that grow tax-free and tax-deferred. And they can take it out tax-free. So you don't ever have to pay any money on the growth if you're using it for a qualified educational expense. So a little bit of background on what a 529 plan is, and go ahead and answer the question about how 529 assets are viewed on the FAFSA.
Yeah. So if the asset is in the grandparent's name and the student is not named as the beneficiary, it's not a reportable asset on the FAFSA.
Well, hold on. What if the grandchild is named as beneficiary? Do they have to list that? Because they're not the owner.
That is something I should research before I answer, because I was actually trying to find the answer to that this morning.
Yeah, I do not, the way I understand it, it would not show up on the grandchild's FAFSA if it's in the grandparent's ownership, because the owner can change beneficiaries at any time. Correct. Yep.
If I'm hearing you correctly, it may be just beneficial to have the grandparent as both the owner and the beneficiary.
Yes, that's true. It could be. However, the recent provision to, if you don't use those funds to turn them into a Roth, are upended by that, because you have to have the same beneficiary for 15 years before you can do that Roth conversion if it's unused money. So
Yeah, I think I agree with Guy on that. You know, if the parent or if the grandparent is the owner, it's not a reportable asset on the student's FAFSA, even if they are named beneficiary. But I would want to confirm that.
So an additional question. So let's say a student has $10,000 in a checking account from all their summer work, and they have a $20,000 529 that they're a beneficiary of for their parents. So is the FAFSA going to look at that and say, hey, we want to take 100% of the 529, but we'll only take 30% of your checking account because that's the percentage you gave earlier?
No, the 529 account is a parent asset if the parent's the owner. So
Gotcha.
it would be considered available at 5.6% or less.
It's interesting. Yep. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, we confirmed that the grandparent owns it, even with the grandchild as the beneficiary. It does not count in their FAFSA. However, if a parent owns it and the child is listed, then it does count as a parent asset. Quick question for you. Is this whole process of financial aid any different from undergrad to graduate school? And I ask because Drake has a law school, you have a pharmacy school, right?
Yep. So by definition, a graduate or professional student is an independent student. So the parent would not be a contributor on the FAFSA. So it would just be the student and spouse, if applicable, completing FAFSA information.
So if you're out of undergrad, bachelor's degree, and you're exploring the next degree, an advanced degree, almost certainly your situation is changing financially in the eyes of the FAFSA.
That's right.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Okay. What else? Questions? We got another question here.
You talked about teacher assistance. Could you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, the federal Teach Grant, I think that was passed around 2012 or maybe it's 2008, but it's been around for a couple decades. This is a grant that students going into teaching can get. They do have to meet some requirements. I think 3.25 high school GPA or having scored at a certain percentile on a standardized test. But yeah, if they're going in, if they meet those requirements and they're going into teaching, they can get up to $4,000 a year in a Teach Grant. We call this in the financial aid industry a groan because it's a grant that will convert to a loan if the student doesn't complete their teaching service. So within 8 years of graduating, they need to have completed 4 years of qualifying teaching service. And that qualifying teaching service has to be at a school that meets a certain threshold of students that qualify for federal reduced price lunch. So students serving needier students, and then it has to be in a high need subject area, which, you know, math, science, special education, pretty reliable in being in that category, but it actually varies by state. And each state kind of determines their teacher shortage disciplines. So those are kind of the broad parameters of the program. Studentaid.gov has a lot more like detailed drill down information, as well as like lookups of like the school directories, like what schools are we talking about. It's not a small amount. I mean, there's a lot of schools that would qualify.
Hey, Ryan, I have another question for you. I've never understood the difference between the private student loan institutions and the public student loan institutions?
So institutions.
Well, I mean, how do you qualify for federally subsidized student loans?
Okay.
Is that all need based?
It is need based. So going back to that financial aid formula, the financial need formula, we have cost of attendance, subtract the student aid index. That gives us the gross need that a student has. To get a subsidized loan, you have to have a remaining need. So we start with that gross need, and then let's say say the student had gross need of $30,000, and then they get a scholarship for $20,000. Now the remaining need is $10,000. So they could qualify for a subsidized loan because they have that remaining need. But if a student had a gross financial need or initial financial need of $20,000 and then they get a $25,000 scholarship, they no longer have any remaining need. So they wouldn't qualify for that subsidized loan.
So does subsidize tied to your FAFSA at all, your SIA?
Yes, yeah. The SAI is a key component of that, but the cost of attendance as well as the other assistance a student is receiving all tie into that federal subsidized loan eligibility.
Okay, and if you don't qualify for that, but you still can't make the ends meet, then you go to the private side and just take a private loan?
Well, there's also a federal direct unsubsidized loan as well, and so it's identical to the subsidized loan except for that interest is accruing as the student is in school. So it's not interest free
right away.
But it has the same fixed interest rate. It has the same repayment terms, the same available repayment plans as a federal student loan. So as well as forgiveness options. So federal student loans, for teachers, there's also forgiveness. So it's not the Teach Grant, but there's federal teacher loan forgiveness programs. There's public service loan forgiveness. So the federal student loan programs have very flexible repayment plan options, and there's some forgiveness options built into it. The biggest disadvantage of federal student loan programs is there's these annual loan borrowing limits. So for an incoming freshman dependent student, they can borrow $5,500 a year. That's it. So oftentimes
that's not doing it for many
Right.
students.
Right. So then beyond that, there's private student loans. So at Drake, we maintain a preferred lender list. So we vet our lenders annually. We rank them actually. That's pretty rare that schools will rank them, but we've been ranking them because we've noticed that some lenders are much, much better than others in terms of the interest rates they're giving our students and the approval rates. And we want to steer our students toward the best financing options available. So yeah, we do an annual request for information. We rank our lenders. We put that list out there for students to go and find the best private loans available.
Another question on the loan front is the parent loans. We have run into those, usually not in good circumstances. When do those apply? How do people get in those? And do you even recommend those at Drake?
Yeah, so the federal Parent Plus loan is only available to students who have done the FAFSA, and it's available to parents of dependent students. So, the parent had to give information on the FAFSA. It is not a real great loan in terms of interest rate. This year, the interest rate is 9.05%. There's also a 4.23% origination fee on that loan.
And just to clarify, the parent loan is, instead of these prior loans we're talking about that are in the name of the student, these are loans that the parents put their name on and become responsible for paying on behalf of their students.
That's right. Yep, it is a parent loan. So the student is not party to that loan, although they are a beneficiary of it. So yeah, that is a big difference. With private loans, usually we're seeing parents needing to co-sign. So the parent is a party on the loan. A lot of our lenders will offer a co-signer release. So after 24 consecutive payments, maybe the parent can come off of that loan. But yeah, with a private loan, the student is the primary borrower. But yeah, that plus loan, it's easier to qualify for. So when parents apply for that, it's not looking at income. It's not looking at debt to income ratio. It's not looking at credit score. not looking at any of those things. It's a check for adverse credit history. So if the parent has a default or a foreclosure or current debt that's like over 90 days delinquent or something, that might disqualify them from the loan. But if none of those are in play, then the parent will be approved and they'll be able to borrow as much as they want. So that's the nice part of that loan, I suppose, is that it's easier to qualify for, but the terms are not great.
Yeah, I would say buyer beware on parent loans. Okay, we have ran out of time. We want to be respectful of everybody that's joined us online. I want to, number one, thank Ryan for being here. I want to thank you all for being here and wanting to learn about this stuff. Thank you for choosing Compass. Thank you for your business. Thank you for your referrals. That's how we grow. Spread the word on our event next month, how to protect yourself from all the crazy stuff going on out there. Look forward to seeing you in a month. Thank you.